In the 21st century. In this book, Picardy argues that inequality is big and it's growing. He spoke yesterday to Saturday Extra's Geraldine Doog, a fascinating discussion. You can catch that at the Saturday Extra page on the RN website. Picardy's argument, it taps into a deep sense we have that the rich are indeed getting richer. Remember the Oxfam report earlier this year that argued that the richest 85 people in the world owned more wealth than the 3.5 billion people who make up the poorest half of the world's population. Picardy confirms this sense, but with rigorous analysis and a simple conclusion that the growth of the economy, the thing that propels growth in the earnings of ordinary people, does not match the earnings of capital. What does that mean? Well, the rich, the owners of capital, will keep getting richer, expanding a gap that Picardy says is already greater than in the 19th century. What are the implications of that? Is Picardy right? And what should we do about it if he is? Certainly a discussion for our times. Joining you now are John Daly. He's CEO of the Grattan Institute, entrepreneur, investor, corporate advisor Mark Carnegie, and former Treasurer Wayne Swan, who this year was asked to join the US Commission on Inclusive Prosperity. That's a group dedicated to reducing economic inequality. Well, welcome to you all. John, can I begin with you? Perhaps just a quick crib sheet on Thomas Picardy's argument.
Of a mere 659 pages.
If you dare.
So, what makes this the cool book that all the policy wonks are reading is that it tries to create a unified theory, if you like, of inequality, both looking at inequality of wealth, so that's the assets you have, your house, your shares, everything else, and the inequality of income, so how much you earn, whether that's from the sweat of your brow or because you've inherited a bunch of assets that then generate an income. And he comes to a number of conclusions. The first is that inequality is rising, and Picardy's not very interested in mere variations from decade to decade. He only really cares about variations over a century. And what he shows is that inequality of wealth was very high in France, in Europe, in the 19th century. It fell quite substantially, essentially from about 1910 onwards. Partly a lot of capital got destroyed in the First and Second World Wars. Partly there were a series of policies that meant that wealthy people paid a lot of tax after those wars. And we also had very rapid growth. And what that meant was that wealth became much more evenly distributed in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And a lot of economists thought, well, that's the new normal in the magnificent new world of growth and rationally ordered economies and so on. And what Picardy shows is that's not true. Wealth inequality is very rapidly rising again. And as I said, it's a unified theory. His argument is that the reason that wealth inequality is rising again is essentially we've seen growth slow to what is probably a more normal rate, with population growth slower and also economic growth per person a little bit slower. And that means we're seeing these very rapidly rising inequalities. And then, of course, he takes to the final stage, which is to say, well, do we care? What should we do about it? And the reason that we care, and I think this is why it's such a powerful book, is that he puts it in terms that the right cares about. And the left's always cared about inequality, but the right cares about the idea that everyone has a chance to get ahead. And he uses a series of literary examples to show that in this world of extreme wealth inequality, essentially people's motivations are to worry more about who they marry and what they inherit rather than to actually work hard.
Mark Carnegie, the American economist Paul Krugman says that this is a book that will change the way we think about society and the way we do economics. Is that your sense of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a phenomenal book. I think it is going to be the sort of true north for all of these discussions for the next decade. And I think without a question about what he's saying is without doing something quickly, you are going to find some way where the return on capital that he describes is going to eat away at the fair go and initiative and all the things that the right and people who believe in capitalism think are the motive forces in getting people to get ahead. that he makes, which is it is going to very quickly become a society where it's far more important to marry a rich woman than work hard in a career. It resonates.
Yeah, this is not just an idle thing, is it, John Daly? There's a fabulous example given in the book where, and this is where Picardy draws on literature, on a wealth of non-economist thinking to illustrate his proposition.
That's right. Well, and for the English-speaking audience, he talks a lot about Jane Austen, and anyone who's read the Jane Austen's books will know they're all about, well, indeed, Pride and Prejudice very famously begins. It's a truth universally acknowledged that a man with a good fortune is in search of a wife, and so those Austen novels are all about who marries whom and how much income do they have. Although, as Picardy points out, when they talk about income, they don't actually mean how much do they earn from going out to work. They mean what is the rent from the estates that they have. And then the other big literary example that he uses, perhaps less familiar to English-speaking audiences, but very, very familiar to French-speaking audiences, is Balzac in general, but in particular his book Pere Goriot. And the lovely example he has from that is Rastignac's a young man who's appeared in Paris, and the old man kind of takes him aside and says, what are you bothering trying to train to be a lawyer for? Even if you become an incredibly successful lawyer and become a judge and all the rest of it, you'll still actually only be, an also-ran in Parisian society. If you want to be seriously wealthy, what you need to do, and have significant income, not just wealth, but significant income, then you need to go and, court the fair lady down the hall.
Inheritance is the thing. I mean, this is a great idea in this book. I mean, Wayne Swan, to bring you in here, this notion of patrimonial capitalism, the return of fabulously wealthy family dynasties, people who may or may not be productive but live a life of wealthy exceptionalism. That's not a thing that falls easily on Australian ears, for example.
No, it's not. I mean, I think there's a couple of points. I guess really what the book is saying is that greater economic inequality through wealth distribution begets greater political inequality. And that is that those people that are doing very well will then have a far greater say in the economic outcomes. And what that then produces is a situation where economic growth itself is threatened by this imbalance. And I think that's the debate that's going on about secular stagnation across the global economy now. For some 20-odd years, everybody has been saying, where are the new sources of growth coming from, apart from population growth in Asia? And in fact, growing inequality is in itself a drag on economic growth. And that's why arguments for equality of opportunity are so important into the future. I guess lastly, he's reaffirming what many on my side of politics have always deeply believed, that the great institutions of the social democratic model, that is a fair industrial relations system, equal opportunity and investment in education and universal health care, they are the foundations of a very healthy capitalist society. And without them, you just get oligarchy.
Mark Carnegie, I mean, this notion of growth is fundamental here, and John mentioned before what now appears to be the anomalous period around the two world wars in the mid-20th century, where growth was accelerated by war, especially in the post-war period, and that has masked this inequality. Is doing something about growth the key to the disproportionate disparity that Picardy talks about?
Well, I mean, I think the problem about it is what he's saying is it's going to be very, very hard to get anything like the numbers that you have historically. And I have to say, I think he's right. If you look at what's going to happen to population growth, it's clearly going to go down. There's a whole series of other arguments that are outside the framework of today that are just talking about the fact that huge amounts of the growth that we got out of the Industrial Revolution, we're just not going to be able to continue to grow at those rates. To my mind, we have to do whatever we can do to continue to be as rapidly growing a society as we can, and that means population growth as well, and immigration and all of those sorts of things. We need to be doing all the things that, Wayne and others were trying to do about improving productivity as much as we can in Australia. But to my mind, all of those things are not going to be enough. If we don't do something about the fact that inevitably the returns on capital are going to be higher than the growth rate, and therefore we are cascading society, and the best of capitalism is going to collapse.
This, John Daly, to me makes our traditional sort of economic responses seem incredibly puny.
Well, we actually have had historically economic responses to this, which are essentially around how does your taxation system work. So at least historically, for example, the United Kingdom at one point had very, very high estate duties. And that's one of the reasons, Picardy argues, that inequality fell in that post-war period, was precisely that there were these very high estate duties. They were justified as essentially paying off the war, and those kind of things are very effective at redistributing wealth. Yes. They're obviously never very popular with people who are otherwise going to be inheriting. It's also about how we tax capital. So, for example, at the moment in Australia, we still have a 50% discount on the earnings of capital gains. Now, I will confess it's unclear to me why it is that we pay more tax if I go out and work hard and less tax on the same amount of income if it's simply come from selling off an asset. I think there's a very good argument to say that that capital gains discount is one of the things that, if anything, concentrates wealth. And you can see that in that something like 50% of capital gains, taxable capital gains in Australia, are earned by the top 2% of income earners. So there are things we can do, and there are some economic instruments that we've already got at least half in place. Some historically have existed. We have choices to make, as always.
And these choices are tricky. I mean, Mark Carnegie, just before, you talk about things like collapse. So I guess that takes us to the point of the discussion on why this matters, why this revelation that Thomas Piketty makes is significant, and if unchecked, what its consequences might be.
Well, I mean, if you look at what happened when the top 10% of people had 90% of the wealth, there was a huge number of people in those societies calling for a revolution. Now, I don't think we're going to get to that stage, and I don't think we're going to be in the land of the revolution. But I also think that we are going to find some political mechanisms to address what Piketty has highlighted. And my point is we need to do it before there isn't some breakout of some sort of Latin American populism that creates a huge, huge problem for the society. If you look at Piketty's numbers, Australia can make a really, really good case for exceptionalism from the Anglo-Saxon Malays. We seem to be far more at the midpoint of the European numbers in terms of egalitarianism. Piketty talks about the idea of a capitalised pension system and then says, but it's impractical. The fact is that Australia has one of those. That's a huge, huge plus for us. I mean, for me, the point is we've got an ability to step in and deal with this now, in contrast to America and England, where I feel like the whole thing's metastasized. And I think we should be doing it in a way that helps our economy continue to prosper and grow rather than turns into the sort of horrible thing that's happening in America, where the tiny group of people at the top are paying 15% tax and the middle class are paying 50%.
And yet, Wayne Swan, we have trouble in this country with a political dialogue around something as regressive as increasing the GST, never mind talking about a wealth tax.
Well, it's worse than that. When I started talking about distribution and the importance of everybody having a stake in our prosperity, I was hung by the neck by the Daily Telegraph and dressed up as Karl Marx.
We do recall that. Yeah.
So it's a very important conversation. I agree with Mark in what he said. We can't go down the American road. We have done something very special here. And whilst there's been a concentration in wealth at the top, when it comes to middle and lower income earners, they've done very well in Australia compared to almost every other developed economy in the world. And the basis for that is a progressive taxation system, and it is the availability of health and education, quality health and education on a universal basis, with a decent industrial relations system that gives labour some bargaining power and a decent minimum wage. Those are the things here that make Australia the envy of the world. It's one of the reasons why our economy is now 15% bigger than it was at the end of 2007, and many of these other developed economies are simply crawling along. So I hope we have a vigorous debate on the back of this book and on the back of so much other analysis that's come out. I mean, you've got The Economist, you've got the Financial Times, all of those quality journals have been talking maturely about this for the last couple of years, because it is a threat, not only to growth here, but a threat to growth globally. And if we don't do something about it, what will flow from the political inequality that flows from economic inequality is basically political disturbance. And I don't think anybody wants that.
This is the challenge, John Daly, isn't it, is to morph this discussion, which is being held on a fairly rarefied level, into a more practical thing based on political solutions.
That's right. And I think the other piece that needs to be brought into this discussion is around housing ownership. So about half of the wealth in Australia, and indeed it's true around the world these days, is not tied up in agricultural land as it was in the time of Jane Austen. It's tied up in essentially the houses that people live in, residential housing. And of course the issue in Australia is that traditionally the way that people from lower middle class backgrounds got wealthy was they started saving for their own home when they were quite young. We have quite high rates, or have had quite high rates of home ownership, and by the time they made it to retirement age, they more or less owned that home. And what we're seeing in Australia at the moment is very rapidly falling rates of home ownership amongst anyone under the age of 55. In part, at least, that's a result of our taxation system. In part, it's a result of our planning system that makes it quite hard to subdivide land in what you might describe as the middle rings of our cities. Those are the kinds of things that in the world that we have, which is different from the 19th century because of this increased importance of residential land, those are the kinds of levers that I think we'll need to look at.
And there are other things like education, for example, that also act to level off. And one last point, Mark Carnegie, and this is, I mean, you're a person of books and ideas. Have you seen the like of something like Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st century in recent times, the way in which a book has so captured universal, global imagination?
Well, I think the last time was Guns, Germs and Steel, Jared Diamond's book. It defined the whole question about the differential, outcomes for different societies and why, and did an absolutely fantastic job of really sheeting that in circumstance rather than anything that talked about, some societies being defective. And to me, the reason why this book is going to be so interesting is not that it is going to be some horrible resurrection of some 21st century communism, but instead it's going to be the book that people who are fighting for the soul of capitalism, people who believe that initiative, the fair go, working hard, all of those things, all of the positive things about capitalism need to be restored and brought to the centre, are going to be able to use to argue against the inheritance and the idea that the best job in Australia you can have is hanging around waiting for your parents to die.
So otherwise known as the return of the Belle Epoque, which look, a fascinating discussion and one which, as we've pointed out, is being echoed in publications and talks like this around the world at the moment, all based on Thomas Piketty's extraordinary book, Capital in the 21st Century. That teamed with the Bob Card Diaries, I think, and you've got your Christmas gift options covered for this year. Thanks to participants in this chat this morning, the CEO of the Grattan Institute, John Daly, entrepreneur, corporate advisor, Mark Carnegie, and former treasurer of the great country of Australia, Wayne Swan. Outsiders is coming.
Okay. Well, I thought that was fairly interesting. The people who are most in favour of capitalism are afraid that the returns on capital are outstripping the background economic growth rate, and that leads to a drift towards knights and dames, I guess, if you ask the budgie smuggling wingnut that we've got clowning about in Parliament House in Canberra. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.